everybody. Right, got it. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Bob MK webinar. Bob MK, as you know, is an urban design network. And this afternoon, we're going to be looking at landscape design and looking at it as it's a very important issue, as something that comes up continually, all at the wrong time, usually at the end of a situation rather than the beginning. But we've got three groups who are going to talk to us. And I hope that you will find that interesting. Maura will talk to you about some of the mechanics of this at some point. But I'm just going to hopefully introduce everybody right at the beginning and a little bit of an introduction. So I don't know how many of you actually came across Ian McHarg's design with nature, but when I was doing urban design, that was absolutely critical element. And he set up this idea of the Centre for Urbanism and Ecology, and was a clear leader in a lot of what we would like to do in terms of landscape design. When we've been involved in urban design, big, large projects, one of the problems has always been the developer and their particular agenda. So they have used words like landscape-led or just colouring. Are we just colouring everything green as urban designers, and somewhere along the line that'll happen. And so landscape-led, I think, is really important, and especially now with the post-corona development that is taking place, and the idea that pandemics and all sorts of other things have got relevance, and that we can't go back to the old normality. We've got to start thinking in a new way and think about landscape in a new way. This has been taken on, by the way, the design groups quarterly. This edition, this is coming up, and I think Paul might touch on that. But it's all about an integrated approach, and landscape has always been seen as a sort of tack-on, and it's not. It's critical and very important. And so having an integrated approach is very important, both as a local authority in reviewing things, but also as a consultant. I have to say that the best urban designers that seem to have been landscape designers, in my experience, but many urban designers are much better at landscape than the landscape designers. So somewhere along the line, there's a sort of very clear overlap, which I think would be interesting to explore. So we have three sessions. The first session is with landscape design associates who are going to bombard us with three people. Tom Perry, who is a leader in urban design, and as we found out just recently, we both worked together on a project, but probably with about 30 to 40 years gap between the two. Anyway, so Tom is going to lead off. He's going to talk about the role of landscape architecture, and he is he previously worked with English Heritage, with the Prince's Foundation, and has worked in very strange places, but importantly, has brought all that experience back, and you will see that influences in the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code, of which he was part of the team that helped put that together with Andy von Bratsky and David Rudlin. So this is very positive, working across disciplines. Ian, who I don't know whether they're he's part of the team that was involved in Broad Street in Oxford, which was a first stage to test the water that dipping the toe into the influence of landscape on urban environments. But so we've got Ian, who's an associate of LDA and had previously worked with English Heritage and is involved in contextual planning and assessment services. So that's him, but he'll be talking about LVIAs, this is landscape and visual impact assessments, and the visualization tools that you need. And lastly, we have David Wesseling, who is an associate of LDA Design, and he'll take us through a case study of that. Because it's a concentrated element, Tom and that there will be a short section, a short time after between Tom and Ian and David, where questions can be asked. So you don't have to hold it on right until the end. So we're going to have some of that. Maura will look after that for us. Then we've got Tim Johns, who's an associate of TEP, the Environmental Partnership, and perhaps will take us into a little bit more detail and maybe some issues on urban environments, because we've got to remember that landscape is also part of our urban environment. And then we have Paul Reynolds, who is the director of Tapestry. Paul is a chartered landscape architect and urban designer, and he's also honorary secretary of the Urban Design Group. He's been working in advising the government of Northern Ireland in urban design and landscape. So that's very good, and both all groups who are here with us have been very supportive of Bob MK, and we've worked together, collaborated on events, and visited some of the works they have done. So we'll see if we can, in this post-corona environment, try and do that again. So the first thing I'd like to do is to introduce Tom Perry, who will take us through the LDA Design role in landscape and visual impact assessment, plus other things. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, John. I'm going to try and share my screen. It's the new trick that I've just been taught. Right, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And thank you for the introductions, John. We will try not to bombard you with too much, but I think there's some great panels, some great people to speak this afternoon. If you've not come across LDA Design, we've grown out of a landscape design practice that started about 40 years ago in Peterborough, but we now have 8 offices around the country, including Cambridge and Oxford. And I think when we think about our approach as an organisation, whether we're working on large-scale growth strategies through to developing master plans or proposals for new homes and infrastructure that we do a huge amount of work on, It's always sort of rooted in an understanding of the landscape and our collective impact on it. So we wanted to share with you a bit of our insight on our approach to placemaking, the tools that we use, and how we support wider policy aims like nature recovery and net zero, which are really important. Ian's going to cover some of the tools for understanding landscape impacts and how we creatively apply them. David's going to talk about an amazing case study at Waterbeach in Cambridgeshire, where landscape was a key part of the placemaking and the master planning. And then I'll come back in and talk a little bit about design coding and design review and how they help guide delivery and try and link that back to the wider policy context. And then we'll have hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end of our little session. So I think the sort of drivers and the policy context for our work is where I want to start off. There's obviously a really significant growth agenda, and we've been hearing about it all week at the party conferences. 300,000 new homes a year, levelling up, high street task force, towns fund, new infrastructure, roads, rail, energy. It's all happening in the authorities that you will represent. There's this mantra of building back better. You know, we're essentially building our way out of a crisis. And sorry, this is a slightly ropey slide, but I think you get the picture. You know, we've had COVID. COVID is one wave, and then, you know, is there going to be a recession coming after it? But actually, it's climate change and biodiversity collapse that are the really big issues that are on the horizon. Well, not on the horizon; they're with us, and we are having to deal with. I'm sure a lot of you will have seen this graphic. You know, the Paris Accord committed us to limiting global warming to a 1.5 degree change. At the moment, we've got a 1 degree change, 1 degree rise, and we're experiencing huge changes in our environment, from wildfires, fires to flooding. There's a huge new park near me that was designed 10 years ago on the basis of 1 in 100-year floods. And that's I've been told that's happened 8 times in the last 10 years. So these things are increasing, both in terms of their impact and in terms of their frequency. I haven't got too many slides that are going to scare you, but I've got a couple. So this is our total global CO2 emissions. Since 1991, we've emitted more carbon than the whole of the previous 250 years. We're at a tipping point. Human-made materials now outweigh biomass for the first time in history. We are sort of fundamentally shifting the dynamic of Earth than we have done over the last 30 or 40 years. On the positive side, 74% of councils have declared a climate emergency, and I'm sure many of your local authorities have. But I know there's a real disparity across local authorities, both in terms of the baseline data that is being used and the plans that are being put in place in terms of how we will get to net zero. There's very little in terms of standardisation of measurement or assessment, and there is a huge number of council-led interventions which are fantastic and really important, but they're quite often small scale. Might be changes to building stock or energy saving or a fleet of new electric cars. You know, all great, but and will have incremental impact, but quite small on the scale of what we actually need. Last year, we did a piece of work with the RTPI to look at a broader range of interventions and to try and understand how spatial planning can support the development of net zero transport. We looked at 40 interventions, and we modelled their impact on carbon emissions in a series of fictional towns that were based on real life data from real life UK towns. And we saw that all these interventions have an impact. You know, broadband, you know, high-speed broadband enabling us to work from home, car clubs, cargo bikes to help with deliveries, you know, more electric cars and bikes and scooters. The only real way to really drastically reduce emissions is to get people out of their cars and try and promote walking and cycling and public transport or shared transport for longer journeys. And then the other driver behind our work is the biodiversity crisis, and we know that you know, humans are having a huge impact on nature. Our global population has doubled since 1970. Our urban areas have doubled since 1992. Over 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. huge rapid expansion across the globe and across the UK, and you know, the Arc and the Southeast is especially stressed in terms of the impacts that we're having on our natural environment. And a recent report said that we'd failed 17 out of 20 UN biodiversity targets that were agreed in 2010. So on almost every indicator, we're not achieving the improvements that we said we would and that we need to do to try and stem this crisis. The Environment Act is intended to create a statutory obligation to create nature recovery strategies, which all local authorities should have to have in place, and they'll argue for a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain. The government's going to commit to a 25-year plan, so I'm told, that leaves the environment in a better state than we inherited, and there'll be specific targets in there around increasing woodland cover, and I think the really important thing is not just creating wildlife-rich habitats and protecting them, but actually how do we link up those protected areas, and how do we create that mosaic of landscape that actually has real biodiversity impact and takes us to a different level. And I think, you know, there are some rumblings that the Secretary of State is going to require a step change in how we set aside land for nature. And talking to a number of local authorities, you know, the call for sites while developing a local plan is for some local authorities is not just about where development takes place, but it's you know, they're looking for places where sustainable energy can be created and where nature can be put back, and that's part of the planning process. So understanding our impact and designing for positive change has never been so important. So I'm going to hand over to Ian. I'm going to stop sharing. Stop share. And Ian's going to share, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we use.
Thanks, Tom. As I suppose we should, as Jonathan said, ask any questions before we progress. Are there any questions, or should we just move on? Move on.
Are there any questions? Because I think that would be very helpful. No, nothing in the chat.
No. Okay, well, we'll crack on, John, and
okay,
there will be a chance for further questions as we go through.
Yeah.
Tom, you painted a wonderfully depressing picture, but it's also really, really stimulating, and we have to act as professionals and as citizens on all of the things that you raised. And for us as a business, as Tom said earlier, landscape really does hold a central place in finding the solutions to the challenges and the crises we face. I've called this LVIA plus, this section, because landscape visual impact assessment is often seen as something that happens, as John said, as a tack on, something that happens at the end of a process. It's assessing something that's been designed. We're very much of the opinion, and as planning officers, we hope you'd agree, that landscape visual impact assessment has to be part of the placemaking process from the outset. It provides an understanding of place, people's relationship with place, and what is valued, and that can then be used to inform how decisions are made in terms of planning, policy, and design. We define landscape as meaning a home territory or place where people belong, and there's a creative aspect to the word as well. What's important, it's not scenery, it's not static, it's not the backdrop to things. It is very much a cultural phenomena, combining natural and human forces that have shaped it, and we're part of the process of shaping it for the future. So in brief, landscape is about people and place and how they interact together and how they shape and define each other. Landscape-led master planning is very much a social endeavour. It's not creating a place for buildings, but creating a place for people. And it's people that really, really matter. And like I said, landscape visual impact assessment is a tool for assessing and communicating the effects of new development. But probably more importantly, it's part of a holistic place-led planning and design process. Tim is going to come on later to discuss some of the detail and provide another excellent case study, but I'm just going to rapidly talk you through some of the basics for landscape visual impact assessment as a platform then for understanding how it can be applied. This slide shows the key documents. At the centre is guidelines for landscape visual impact assessment, and as planning officers, I presume the majority of you have to review the work undertaken by landscape professionals in terms of the landscape visual impacts assessments they do. It should be compliant with this. It should be informed by landscape character assessment guidance and townscape character assessment guidance on the left. Any visualizations need to follow Landscape Institute guidance. And when undertaking a review, there is a technical guidance note by the Landscape Institute on how that review should happen. So they're the key documents, I think, in the world of landscape visual impact assessment. These are the basic steps of the process. And like I say, this should be evident as something that's been undertaken from the earlier stages of project. But like I say, these are the steps that one should go through. We identify the scope, we identify and assemble the baseline to define what we call receptors. We need to understand the development and the opportunities there are to influence the design. We understand and predict change to then inform mitigation. But importantly, mitigation is only part of the story, and we have to be evidentially influencing the design process. Then, of course, at the end of the process and throughout, we're assessing the significance, and it's part of an iterative process of assessment, consultation and design. And then ultimately we communicate the findings, and communication of findings is critical, that both in the assessment, but also evidencing how the process has informed the design decisions made. You have an important role if you're a landscape officer or a planning officer in a local authority in working with the landscape professional undertaking the LVIA to agree its scope. Really, really important that you're engaged early on in the process. It needs to be proportionate. I think landscape visual impact assessments are very typically the longest chapters in an environmental statement, and they need not be if we're able to focus on what matters. What helps is looking at the study area and the receptors. It's really important. The methodology is all very, very clear, and that there's an allowance for ongoing dialogue between the assessment team and the design team and with the client, just to make sure that the understanding of landscape and its the receptors, etc., are influencing design. So we define receptors, and they can be landscape receptors, and landscape character is critical. Many local authorities have a good landscape character assessment, often not up to date, but it's really important that the baseline landscape character assessment is checked, it's refined based on field work. It may need a bit more site scale understanding if the assessment you're using is strategic, and it should be referencing other published materials such as historic landscape character assessment. And baseline is important because understanding landscape is critical to influencing how the design evolves. Visual receptors are people whose views might be affected by change. A ZTV, a zone of theoretical visibility model, is useful, and we'll come on to that in a bit, but fieldwork is essential again. It's no good, and I have seen this not by LDA people, but using Google Earth and online material to avoid having to do site visit. Evidence of site visits is absolutely essential. Again, be proportional. You don't need to cover every possible view in the assessment. And there are specific types of visual receptor, representative, specific, and illustrative, and each one is selected and used for a different purpose. And you'll have these slides, I think, to refer to in the future, because we do need to skip through this quite quick. Protected landscapes, it's really important that there is an assessment undertaken of the effects of any development on a protected landscape. And again, understanding the natural beauty special qualities, for example, of an AONB is essential in defining how a design should respond, as well as how it should respond to landscape character and visual considerations. And when we come to a part of the assessment, we need to identify those aspects of the development that may lead to landscape or visual effects, and establish those opportunities to influence the proposals, design out adverse effects, and create betterment through an understanding of landscape, visual receptors, etc., to inform design. And that, like I said, is part of iterative process. It can't all be done at the end. It has to be done throughout the designing process. We're all aware of what mitigation means. It can be embedded, or it could be additional in the form of a landscape management plan. It's really important, I think, to work collaboratively with other consultants. Landscape mitigation is often delivered alongside heritage, recreation, ecology and drainage measures, and quite often that's captured as part of a green infrastructure or a landscape strategy. And also noise. The mitigation measures for other technical disciplines, for example, noise, may have adverse landscape effects. So it's really important to have dialogue with other members of the team to have a holistic view on mitigation and design. And then there's the process of assessing significance. Again, we won't go into the detail, and Tim may well cover this much better than I will. Significance is the importance of or gravity of the effect. Informing the judgment, you need to understand the magnitude of effect and the sensitivity of the receptors. It's all based on an agreed scope and methodology, using those defined landscape and visual receptors, and it includes consideration of the mitigation measures. And what's really important is when this is presented, it's all very clear and the terms are very clearly defined in the landscape visual impact assessment that's presented. And when you're communicating the findings or having them communicated to you, it's really important that the report is clear and concise. As I said, the methodology and terminology used are defined and explained. I think it's really important that the author demonstrates how the baseline is understood in terms of the landscape character and visual receptors and designated landscape in particular. It's helpful to show how collaboration has informed the assessment, typically with heritage and ecological consultants. I think in the old days, there was a use of matrices too much. What's really important is that judgments are explained using a narrative approach so people understand them, and use maps and visualizations proportionately. And really importantly as well, I think we have a role in informing the design and access statement and having a good section in that to explain how landscapes inform design. And just quickly, these are some of the typical plans you can see, and these are for the Water Beach project, which David will talk about next. This is landscape character. This is the zone of theoretical visibility, and in this instance, because it was a flat landscape, it was very widespread. The study area was contained and agreed with the local authority was where significant effects could arise, and that informed viewpoints. So there's an area beyond the study area where views are possible, but it wasn't necessary to have viewpoints in that wider zone because the effects weren't going to be significant. And these are the kind of visualizations and visual material you can also include. A viewpoint plan showing the existing baseline with a narrative to explain what you're looking at. And then you'll see these, which are wireframe views, really useful in presenting the findings of the LVA, but also as a tool in the iterative process to model and test effects. So here in a wireframe, it's overlaying onto the photograph. And then this is a photo montage where vegetation is modeled and cut out to show the effects of development at year 1 and then year 15 when mitigation planting has become established. And just to offer, we've done it for Buckinghamshire relatively recently. We have training packages that we can do, and I'll also cheekily give a shout for the Setting of Heritage Assets and Places, which is run by Oxford University Department of Continuing Education, which is run every year in May. It didn't happen last year because of COVID, but we're just designing the course now for May 2022. And at that point, I think I pass on to Dave and his case study, which is Waterbeach.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just share my slides. Bear with me. Okay. Yeah, so I'm a master planner and landscape architect and a regular collaborator with Ian. And what we wanted to do now is just share one example of how some of those tools and sort of the work that Ian does has been applied alongside our sort of design activities, our master planning and urban design on one of our projects. So we'll be using Waterbeach, as Ian said, which is a new town to the north of Cambridge. It's around 10,000 homes in terms of its scale. But the processes and the lessons that we learned are transferable. We think we've used this on a number of projects over the years together. And we've been working on Waterbeach for over 10 years together on behalf of the landowners. We've promoted the site through the local plan stages and recently secured outline planning consents for the whole scheme, and also detailed consents for the first phases of infrastructure, which includes a new railway station and some of the first landscape elements. So from my perspective as a master planner, the processes and the tools that Ian described are essential to the placemaking process. With a landscape architecture background as well, I suppose I'm sort of quite alert to that. But for them to be fully utilised and fully appreciated, they must feed into the iterative process that Ian described of exploring the findings of that work together and jointly, and actually in the same kind of creative spirit. So it's not just a separate technical exercise that's undertaken in the background. It's very much a part of the creative process of placemaking. So I see my role really as being one of curiosity and asking questions and being asked questions of, inviting challenge, drawing ideas together and possibilities together. And really the outputs of a master planner are only as good as the information and the activities that go into shaping it. So through describing 4 aspects of Waterbeach, what we hope to demonstrate today is the potential of the creative application of those tools that you described. And as Ian said, for us to be landscape-led is to find and to give meaning, is to drive character, but also function, and to hopefully arrive at better and broader project outcomes. So it's really about that understanding the patterns of living, how those have changed, and how those can evolve to tackle some of the issues of today that Tom described in his introduction. So before we sort of go into the case study, we thought it would be helpful to focus a little bit on the design process that sits alongside the processes that Ian described. So we've borrowed here 4 design activities that are described by the Design Council in their work called Beyond Net Zero. We can't go into it too much detail here, but it's well worth reading in terms of a process that's set out to tackle complex challenges like the ones that we are talking about today. The headlines of these 4 design activities are quite helpful in terms of helping us summarize the creative process that Ian and I followed on Waterbeach. And the first of that is exploring. So as Ian described, it's about understanding the existing and the enduring qualities of the landscape, but also the changing qualities of the landscape at the same time as understanding those pressures for change. The second is reframe, which for us was about defining the project's outcomes whilst challenging and broadening the concepts of what can be achieved with the knowledge that we gained from the first step of exploring. The third is to generate, which for us is starting with bold ideas that achieve those outcomes from the reframing process. And the idea is that those ideas are layered onto existing systems, existing natural and human systems, always building on what has come before. And really at this stage, the ideas should always be to then prompt further thinking and new ideas that should open new avenues of exploration. And then the fourth then is called Catalyze, which is about testing, iteration, refining and improving the proposals. So in terms of putting those 4 steps into action, the first element of our case study that we wanted to talk about is the influence of the wider landscape. And this is something which I think is very often spoke about in strategic planning and planning new settlements and urban extensions, but I think rarely actually seems to find a meaningful expression in the final result and in the final proposals. At Waterbeach, the starting point for this was a recognition that this wasn't Cambridge. It was close to Cambridge, but Waterbeach isn't Cambridge. The villages and communities that surround the city vary enormously in terms of their scale and in terms of their character, which itself is influenced by the landscape, which varies on each side of the city as well. And Waterbeach is on the edge of the Fens, which, as you probably know, it's quite a remarkable landscape, expansive landscape, but also actually quite an unsettling and challenging landscape as well. So how do we create the comforts and the intimacy that we want in a new community to thrive in this kind of larger scale, unsettling landscape? So one of the existing qualities that we identified in this landscape is that of the Fenn Islands, the pattern of Fenn Islands, which are positioned on areas of slightly elevated land that would have been drier than the peat fens that sit in between. And we took this idea of the islands into what we described as the fenstead. So the idea being that we could define both an inside landscape and an outside landscape, and to break down the huge scale of the new town into neighbourhoods at a more manageable scale. So the outside landscape, which we refer to as the droves and larger areas of open space and landscape, could take their design language literally from the surrounding Fenland landscape in terms of their linearity, in terms of some of their functions, managing water. But the inside landscape could contrast that and become much finer grained and much more people oriented. And this approach began to drive the master planning response to the point where we also agreed that to achieve this contrast, to achieve this juxtaposition, we would largely exclude cars from the inside of these fensteads to really try and amplify the difference in scale and the difference of experience between the two landscape types that we were exploring. So much like in the wider Fenn Islands, we were seeking to create that juxtaposition of both a large-scale fen landscape, but more habitable, comfortable spaces in between, and importantly, the functions of both of those types of environment. So then applying that wider influence across the site, we were able to use the structure of the underlying and surrounding landscape to organize the site, as you can start seeing the plan on the left of the larger scale drainage ditches and roads following that existing pattern, then imposing the fensteads into that pattern, and then within the fensteads starting to describe and draw out the finer grained car-free routes that could link the communities together and link all of the parts of the new town together. And the plan on the right, which we call the sociable streets, and that really was to invite people to spend more time outside of their cars in communities where walking and cycling was really encouraged and the most attractive option for healthier, more local and lower impact lifestyles. So responding to the sites, this sort of second element that we wanted to talk about, and this is obviously something which is more direct, very often reacting to a physical characteristic of the site itself, perhaps quite familiar territory here. So, but what we think we can achieve with this can be amplified, I think, if we're following those 4 design activities of explore, reframe, generate, catalyze rigorously. So The example that we wanted to share is Bannock Drove. So this is an existing ditch and right of way that initially stood out to us on this site because of its meandering course in an otherwise very regular, very linear landscape. So this isn't a designated landscape feature, but we felt from our site visit, from our site work, that it was quite remarkable nonetheless. And then through exploring this, we found its meandering qualities probably dated it to an earlier period than the draining of the fens, and looking at the historic maps, it also actually seemed to, picking it out here, it also seemed to define the eastern extent of the huge area of fens that extended all the way to the coast. So a wonderfully significant and historic, but perhaps underappreciated line in the landscape. And for us, it became an organizing feature of the plans, as we're showing on the right. It started to, when we started to draw it out, we were able to organize a plan, so it connected everything together: the existing village, the railway station, the local centres, the schools, right up to the Fenland parks and the open countryside to the north. And that we were keen that it continued to have significance in this landscape. It was placed very centrally. All of the overlapping mitigation that Ian talked around, drainage, landscape, heritage, etc., were drawn together in this example. And it was retained some of those functions from its past in terms of the movement of people, water, and wildlife. So the next aspect of the case study we just want to talk about is defining the threshold. So the interaction of built and unbuilt, the views in and out of the development, something that, as Ian picked up, is often defined through the LDA process. And that was no different here, but we included it just to articulate the value and the impact of photo montages in striking the right balance. So here there was a particular area of tension around the aspiration to create something very urban and very lively, particularly around the station, railway station, which is shown here, which would be positioned right against the eastern edge of the new town, directly adjoining the open landscape. So we adopted all the design activities from exploring the wider influence of landmark buildings in the fens to identifying the key views, testing the design responses with verified views and the photo montages that Ian described. And through that process, the results are shown on these plans, all the tools that were available to us, from having an area of intensity to the south, where we would have individual taller buildings that could stand as landmarks, but importantly that the scale decreased quite rapidly as we moved north, and then eventually transitioning into a more urban, more rural conditions as we got to the very north. So the final aspect we just wanted to share was that we call defining a healthy living infrastructure. So at Waterbeach, this is perhaps best exemplified by the Fenland parks to the north of the new town. They draw together activities and functions to support the new community, like recreation, water management, creating space for nature on a very large scale. And provide space to address all of those challenges that Tom was describing: climate change, biodiversity, water management, health, all those issues. And again, looking back, making sure the proposals related to what's come before and layering those onto the existing systems. It's possible to see in the historic maps the difference between the raised areas of land around Benny Abbey, the drier fields in the eastern parts, in contrast to the areas called here Joyce Fen that would have been very different. And the plans that we developed sought to enhance that transitional landscape between that had been lost through the draining of the fens and then subsequently through farming and agriculture. So we were seeking to recreate areas of wetland, reed beds reminiscent of the peat fens with limited access, as would have been the case historically, with a view to establishing space for the storage of water and quiet areas of wildlife in the east, shown on the right here, to the west, where drier meadows and grasslands could be reintroduced, linear channels and tree belts to create a sort of a renewed landscape structure for greater levels of human activity as well, sports, as well as filtering views to heritage features like Denny any abbey. So here in the Fenland parks, as with a number of the other aspects we've talked about, actually the plans we've shared today, it's about bringing together both the existing qualities of place whilst addressing the pressing needs of today's challenges, where we see that real value of a landscape-led approach and bringing all of those influences together and how they can define placemaking. And to us, I think as Jonathan said at the beginning, working closely is essential to realizing that value. It's through a creative dialogue that's supported by the rigor and the tools that Ian described. So if I hand back to Tom at this point, that he'll describe a few more of the tools of how the design process is managed in terms of design coding and design reviews.
Thanks, Dave. Just make that full screen. Yeah, so I just to bring us to a close, I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that we're developing with the RTPI to look at the role of design codes, specifically around delivering net zero and nature recovery. So the current MPPF, or the updated MPPF, mandates local authorities to create and utilise design codes. We're obviously hearing in the last few days, potentially the new Secretary of State may ditch the idea of zonal development, but design codes have been used in the UK for many decades. They're a great way of ensuring design quality at a local scale, but they can also provide a coherent spatial framework at a regional level. The National Model Design Code was created last year, I think, to aid local authorities in developing design codes. I'm sure many of you have seen it. The narrative at the time was really around beauty and building beautiful. But for me, the process of design coding, also has a very significant role to play in how we plan spatially across large areas and protect land for nature and to mitigate against the worst of climate change. And we think the approach we're taking at the minute with the RTPI could equally just fit into a local plan process. If you've not used design codes, the idea is that they're a simple, concise, illustrated set of requirements that are visual and numerical. They give the parameters for the physical development of a site or an area. The National Model Design Code builds on the National Design Guide, which set out the 10 characteristics of well-designed places on the left here. And will also sit alongside the emerging new manual for streets, and they will be the 3 core design drivers in national policy. Design codes are generally used at a site level in the UK, but if you build on the work and tools that Ian describes, I think you can use them at a district scale, and that helps you create a spatial response to delivering nature recovery and enabling growth, I would say. So these are the 4 scales that the National Model Design Code suggests codes could be created at. In the UK, we've not really seen them at a local authority level, but I have worked on them in a number of countries where they've been at quite a large scale in terms of the landscape. We follow in the work that we're doing for the RTPI, we're following the process that's set out in the National Model Design Code to try and to give people a clear steer on how to develop them. We've added a key extra step for us, which is to link a 30-year vision for an area to critical success factors. So those are quantifiable targets that tell you what good looks like and enable you to understand when your vision has been achieved, or they feed into the development of the vision. And then we've also developed a set of objectives that enable criteria-based assessment of proposed sites. So the aim there is that actually we use this methodology to create net zero neighbourhoods that put nature at the heart of them right from day one. And we're demonstrating a clear link back from national policy right the way through to a local vision and what the defined outcomes of that vision are. I think with a lot of these projects that I've worked on, and Ian and David as well, you find that if you get the big moves right, from the movement network through to landscape connectivity and the network of streets and spaces that are the kind of framework for people to interact and socialize and commerce and all the other things that we love about our towns and cities and villages, then you create a place that is it's livable, but it's also sustainable and resilient. Transport makes up around 16% of our carbon emissions, so the location of sites and the spatial framework is absolutely critical to how we tackle net zero. But also in terms of making, fantastic places that people actually want to live and work in. The research is going to be launched in December. We are just sort of keeping an eye on what's happening this week and in the coming weeks in terms of announcements about potential further planning reform. But we think, design codes have been around for a long time. They are a fantastic tool, but we just wanted to be able to take it slightly away from that beauty conversation and think about how they can impact and deliver some of those bigger policy drivers. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on design review. My previous role was at Design Council, who ran a number of national and local design review panels. It's a process that's been around for 200 years, I think, roughly in England. The NPPF still recommends it as a tool that should be in place by all local authorities. And I know a number of you do have processes in place for design review. From my perspective, they can be operated at very little cost beyond officer time to local authorities. And I think the really important thing from my perspective with the panels that we ran at Design Council was that we rarely talked about aesthetics, and actually it was thinking about design in its broadest sense. So thinking about design process, thinking about the engagement process that's happened, alongside all the kind of core subjects, so landscape, placemaking, sustainability, inclusive design, architecture, and from my experience, cities like Oxford, like Cambridge, have and I know we worked on a number of reviews in places like Milton Keynes and Stevenage and other places. They've utilised panels to drive up the quality of design and raise expectations of developers. So developers know that when they're coming to build or put something together in a city or in a authority area, that actually there are standards here and we expect the best, and you're going to be reviewed, and that's, I think, a really important part of the process to drive up design quality. From my experience, the best review processes challenge the applicants to deliver better quality, but they're also challenging councils to think about whether you've got the right policies in place, and also the clients to understand the brief that was set and whether actually the designers are working with the right brief. I know a lot of authorities just bring them in for major developments, but I think Cambridge is just about to set one up at the county level, and I've certainly seen, including in places like Oxford, where they can be fantastic, not just at looking at buildings and new development sites, but a really broad range of schemes, and also the development of policy and guidance and developing briefs for external consultants. So actually, local authorities who have developed a brief can take that to a review panel or the chair of a review panel and just get some input and support and guidance about making sure that the quality of the brief is there so that you actually get the outcomes that you want. So I suppose this is just a final little kind of call to you all to recommend you putting in place design review structures and processes to help support the work that you're all doing in your local authorities. And that's us. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, we're happy to take a few now. I think we've got 5 minutes-ish.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom, Ian and David, for a very broad range of information all about landscape and some of the exciting LDA design projects. As John said, many people will be familiar with the work they did in Broad Street, and we've also got an offer from David, who worked on that, to come and present how the Broad Street project has worked. And as we know, it's been extended a bit longer because it's been so successful. So can be quite interesting, hopefully, for us to look into as well. If anyone's got any questions, do put them in the chat. We also can take questions at the end as well. If we haven't got any specific questions on all these different presentations from LDA Design. All seems very quiet at the moment.
I can see that Bob MK is the review panel. I hadn't realised that, so that's great. But this is a collective review schemes. Is that right, Maura?
Yes. We've been doing design review, and I think that's sort of where the heart of Bob MK initially started, because there wasn't design services offering across sort of the local regions. So that's where Bob MK set up. We don't do lots and lots, but we do support some of our different local authorities. As many people know, Oxford's got the ODRP, which they use. But yeah, Bob MK work across Cherwell, Southern Vale, Bucks, etc. So yeah, call on us for all your design advice. We're here to help you with that. As the questions haven't arrived yet, we shall move forward, and if they come, we will have them at the end of Tim's presentation. So we welcome Tim, who's come from up north, as he explained himself, to discuss with us LVIA and other landscape scenarios. Tim is 25 years at the Environmental Partnership and very experienced across all aspects of landscape, and also does some lecturing at Manchester University. So some of it may cross over a little with what Ian was saying, but obviously that is the subject. So over to you, Tim, please.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. Is that right, Maura? Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bob MK, for the invitation to speak with you today. Based in Manchester, as Maura said, and hopefully I can bring a bit of a northern flavour to the discussion today. In case you don't know, the Environment Partnership, we were founded, we're a bit younger than LDA, but we were founded about 25 years ago in the northwest of England. But we now have satellites in London, Cornwall, Market Harbour, and Gateshead, and we have a multidisciplinary arrangement, 140 staff across design, town planning, green infrastructure, ecology and heritage, and certainly more disciplines, GIS as well. So I'm also going to talk about LVIA and placemaking, but I'm hoping that I can complement what Ian has already presented to you. I've got a couple of examples, so it's possibly more of a nuts and bolts worked example, which hopefully, as I say, will complement Ian's earlier presentation. What is LVIA? I also have a couple of slides on Townscape visual impact assessment, conscious that many of you are sort of urban based. So again, a project that I can show you that we've just started working on, in fact, but nevertheless has got some early lessons for us. The process of LVIA and sort of working through a worked example, and then finishing off with an example from Cheshire, actually an allocated site where we recently submitted an outline planning application, but we were an integrated team of master planners and LVIA specialists. So I'm going to gloss over one or two of these earlier slides because Ian amply went through these already, but the key thing really is that idea of using the tool and understanding significance, meaning, which are the receptors that really count when assessing landscape and views. And moving on to Townscape, it follows a very similar process to LVIA, but obviously with a different subject matter, more about development, the grain of built form, the layout scale and massing of buildings, the network of streets and their relationship to building form, and of course not least views and views across the street scene, And as you can see in the example there, views across Townscape, across this public square in Market Harbour, and picking up some of the skyline views and the spires and the old textile works in the middle of the picture there. So we have just started working on one of the levelling up projects. This one in particular is in St Helens, which is a multi-million-pound investment for the town centre. And hopefully you can see with my hand there the arrangement of the master plan boundary, and it's a significant remodelling and reconstruction of a sort of 60s town centre with lots of multi-storey car parks. But peppered within the town centre, you can see there in the quay, there are a number of listed buildings, and also adjacent to the line edge red of the master plan are two conservation areas. So I'm just going to flick to the next slide, which is a working plan, but it just kind of hopefully gives you from space, so to speak, the kind of grain and character of the townscape. I think you can certainly be that classic sort of northern town with the terraces up to the north there, and the emerging ring road along to the west, the sort of out of town supermarkets, the shutter zone, so to speak, with the surface car parking. We also have an elevated railway coming through here on the south of the town centre, up past the eastern part of the site. But within that, some excellent heritage. So we are working as a very sort of integrated team. From TEP, we're advising on Townscape and Visual alongside heritage, and engaged with the wider design team, the architects and the public realm designers, and particularly looking at early doors with the representative views. So it's great having contact with yourselves through these local authority officers in terms of their excellent local knowledge. And what we're doing here, as you can see, these representative views mocked on the plan as a way of capturing some of those typical views. Kind of one of the key issues we've established early doors really with heritage is there are two key churches. This is St Helens Parish Church, which is actually an early 20th century landmark building, but there's obviously concern that the views towards that from all parts of the town are maintained, so that will be a key consideration. And also, just to pick up the railway line, I alluded to that earlier there, this is viewpoint 5, and this is an elevated railway, and this is really where people arrive at the town for the first time, so those first impressions really count. And viewpoint 2 there is from the access or from the exit of the station, and again, that's sort of important first impressions. So I think this is going to be an excellent TVIA to be involved with, and I'm confident that most of our judgments are really going to be about beneficial effects. It's really going to be about improving the town centre environment and the townscape, so it's going to be really exciting to be involved with. So one or two more slides on LVA, and as I say, I may just skip through one or two more where there is repetition, but you may have come across these different terms between landscape and visual impact assessment and at the bottom of the screen there, landscape and visual appraisal. And that's really just finding an output that's suitable to the situation. So at the top there, the most formal of the outputs, the LVIA, always forms part of an environmental statement. A landscape and visual assessment would typically be undertaken for a standalone project that's not subject to EIA, but nevertheless of a reasonable size. And also increasingly common are these landscape and visual appraisals, which would be a standalone appraisal for a smaller development, say a housing development of sort of 20 to 25 units. And in terms of engaging LVA, as colleagues have said already, it's really important to get that going from the start, and we're increasingly finding that. I just really wanted to touch on representative views. We We find, particularly with some of the volume house builders, that they get us involved very early to sort of determine those representative viewpoints, to assist with their development process and to feed into that, but also as a way of engaging with the local authority. So we like to have that engagement with officers and that sort of local knowledge to feed into the selection of those representative viewpoints. So in terms of the process, early doors, we certainly tuck into a good desk-based study and looking at the sort of landscape baseline, kind of understanding what the character and the elements around the site or the area that we're looking at. And I've used the, on the right there, we have the diagram from Natural England's national guidance, which I always find a really good sort of way of sort of getting into the assessment of landscape character. If you look at that and imagine a clock face, so if you imagine that we're at 9 o'clock here where my hand is, and we're going up to actually 1 o'clock here, the sort of natural elements of landscape character. And I think you'd all agree that geology, landform, hydrology are sort of key drivers to those natural elements of landscape character. And if this was again, as the clock face, if this was 1 o'clock and then we were moving to 3 o'clock, the kind of cultural elements of landscape and land use, how have humans developed the landscape over time? Has it been through agriculture or forestry or even through development and enclosure, the way that our previous generations have kind of carved up or articulated land fields to help them in their sort of agriculture. Now, at the bottom of the diagram here, we've got 3 o'clock across to 9 o'clock, so to speak. We're kind of into the more perceptual and aesthetic elements of character. Looking at memories and associations. As a young boy, I was taken to the Lake District National Park, and I think I've pretty much been back every year since then, and that's got a really strong memory for me. And that's probably similar for us when we consider those special places and has an impact on how we perceive character. And staying with the Lake District, the key associations there with William Wordsworth, the poet, Beatrix Potter, the philanthropist and writer, who bought up lots of land for public benefit, now taken over by the National Trust, and all those key elements in how we perceive landscape character. And then moving over here to the from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, the way we our senses, so the dominant sense, which is sight, obviously, and color, texture and pattern, and how we see the landscape, but not forgetting the sound and the smell and touch and feel. So just putting this into practice, this is one of our case studies, actually down in Cornwall, Stydian's Reservoir, between Redruth and Falmouth, if you know that area. And again, I've obviously recreated the Natural England diagram just as an aid to assessing the landscape there, and you can see that hydrology has a big impact there with the reservoir in the middle ground. It's sort of a gently rolling landscape with higher ground in the distance. In terms of enclosure, you can see the field boundaries, how they've probably evolved over the years, and there's probably been quite a lot of field amalgamation. And in the foreground looks more like a sort of semi-natural moorland habitat. So when we're looking at our desk-based assessment, we pick up the national character area profiles that Natural England have prepared for the whole of England, and then look at the local landscape character assessment. And once we get on site, it's down to us to really get that sort of the look and feel of the character. Now, this is again the Stydian's Reservoir here. This is a base map prepared in GIS, and I just really wanted to show you this because of the some of the designations there. We have in the sort of yellow colour there the World Heritage Sites in Cornwall, and you may just be able to work out the crosshatch there of the area of great landscape value, and they're significant because they start to affect the sensitivity in terms of the judgments for the LVI process. So important that we've established kind of the baseline sort of designations. Now, just so you know, in terms of going into further detail on later slides, the development here is actually extending a water treatment works just to the eastern edge of the reservoir. Colleagues spoke earlier about a zone of theoretical visibility, and we run a program by our GIS team, and this just gives a kind of a sense of the theoretical visibility of the development proposals. And what we're showing here is the in the pink the taller buildings and their visibility, and the smaller buildings in the sort of orange tone. And before we go out on site, it's just a great tool for sort of establishing visibility of the proposed development, and also as a sort of entry into speaking to the local planning officer and agreeing the viewpoints. And you can see the various viewpoints that we eventually went on to assess. And then this is about determining sensitivity in terms of views, and I'll run through this very quickly. This is in terms of value, so we define sensitivity as a combination of the value of the view and the susceptibility of the receptor. And because this is a local, because this particular viewpoint was in a local landscape designation, it had medium value. But in terms of susceptibility of the receptor, it was for a user of a public right-of-way. And obviously any changes in the landscape would have quite an effect. And so the judgment there is high susceptibility. And in terms of the overall judgment, a high sensitivity for that particular receptor. And when we're assessing effects, we're looking at, what extent of the view would be affected, what proportion of the development would be in the view, and, would it affect wider panoramas, and what would be the distance from the receptor to the development proposal. And this is a relatively close viewpoint. You can see the water treatment works there, the dam of the reservoir just to the left of the screen, and the actual development proposal was going to be taking us up onto the higher part of the hill, sorry. As part of before we actually make our judgments, we always consider mitigation and enhancement. What are the mitigation measures that we could take as part of the design process. Primary mitigation measures, really those integrated measures within the development. Secondary really is just to capture anything that couldn't be addressed in terms of residual effects that still remain. And enhancement is the term used, which is kind of the over and above mitigation. So it seeks to improve the landscape resource and visual amenity over and above the baseline condition, and that's obviously a real opportunity for placemaking. So our landscape plan for the water treatment works, so just to recap, the development footprint was going to be extended onto the higher ground there, and in simple terms, what we agreed with the planning officer was that it wouldn't be appropriate just to have a kind of mass area of screen planting. It just would be totally out of character. But what we have here is a kind of network of public rights of way, and it'd be much more suitable in character to have a kind of wide native hedgerow that would be more in keeping with the local area. So back to our assessment. So with mitigation in mind, we can then go on and work out what the judgments would be in terms of the assessment effects. So taken, we know that our sensitivity judgment there, it's a high sensitivity receptor. What would be the scale of change? Well, we went for medium because you can see there in the slide, this development's already present. So the scale of change would be, more modest than a kind of virgin site. Nevertheless, it was taking the development up onto sort of higher grounds. So we went for the medium magnitude of effect. And in terms of overall effect, again, we plumped for major because it was a high sensitivity receptor, but with a medium magnitude of change. So just to round off, I have another example. This is land at Congleton Road in Cheshire. And this is where we have been leading the master plan work for an allocated site at the edge of Greenbelt in Cheshire, but very much an integrated team with LVIA in the team, sort of working hand in hand with the master planners. So again, viewpoint plan, a basic plan, and you can see the allocated site there in the sort of coloured line boundaries with the network of public rights of way, particularly to the south and west. And we agreed with the planning officer these representative views. They were seen as the key views to assess in terms of the effects on the development, but also as a means to assist with the master planning and placemaking approach. Now, this is one of the viewpoints, and it just hopefully gives you a sense of that Cheshire character, the wide sort of mixed hedgerows, the copse of trees, the hedgerow trees, also the tendency for ponds, marl ponds, characteristics of the area. And so anything, whatever we would try to sort of integrate with that landscape and use that sort of character assessment to inform the master plan proposals for the green infrastructure. So just a couple of slides really to take you through the design evolution. So you can see that we've plotted the existing hedgerows and woodlands. These are very clear there and would obviously be retained at all costs. A greenfield site, so it's all improved grassland, maybe just able to make out some of these yellow arrows, which were the views into the site that needed to be considered really in the design proposals, particularly these in the purple here, the public right of way to the southwest. And I don't think I mentioned, but there's also a local landscape designation over here to the west as well. So we have this emerging concept diagram. Really, in the crosshatch there, the yellow, in the green, that was really about creating that important buffer with the green belt to the west, the views and the buffer to the north, again, very important. And this sort of emerging green infrastructure across the site, sort of permeating the site, but particularly along the western edge, because this was deemed to be the most sensitive and the most important to consider. And we started to, particularly with the housing, the next slide will be clearer about that, but we wanted to make sure that the scale of the development parcels was in keeping with the sort of the wider landscape, that sort of more fine-grained character. Now this I think it's coming up to my last slide actually. Yes, this is the kind of strategic framework which was submitted as part of the outline planning application. In the purple there is an employment area, and deliberately we placed that really in the centre of the site so that it would be away from the more sort of sensitive edges. The kind of orange colour are these sort of more fine-grained parcels of housing, and then you can see the kind of network of green infrastructure that sort of permeates the whole site and sort of creates some really interesting sequence of spaces along the western edge of the proposed master plan. So yes, that's in for planning, and I think that's pretty much my last slide. So really just in terms of take home for you, LVI deals with changes to landscape as a resource, people's views and visual amenity. It's in terms of the actual assessment, that worked example I took you through, it's that magnitude of change. What's the change proposed alongside the sensitivity of the receptor to measure the overall effect, and that sort of increasing importance of LVI as an integral part of scheme design and placemaking. Really good early engagement with planning officers such as yourselves, deciding the rep views, and then making sure that placemaking is really part of the master plan. Thank you.
That was great, Tim. Thank you very much, and very, very clearly explained. So even me could understand all the detail there. Any questions for Tim? Please put them in the chat. Any questions for any of our speakers? We are a couple of minutes behind time, so we'll move on to Paul. So please put the questions in the chat and we'll deal with them at the end. Okay, Paul, ready to go?
I'll mute myself. Yeah, just about, I think.
Lovely.
Right. Let me just do my screen share. Okay. Can everyone see that, hopefully?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me along. Like sort of all the other speakers, I'm going to be talking a bit about landscape design and kind of how landscape can lead the design of new places and new urban environments. I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle to the other speakers. What I want to run through are 10 criteria, designing for nature criteria that we work to as a practice here at Tapestry. We're probably the youngest of the practices that have been presented today. We've been around for about 10 years now in various guises. But what I want to show you is some kind of principles, really using generic examples, and then just a couple of schemes that we've been involved in directly ourselves. So I think the first point that I would always say when looking at designing for nature is that you have to kind of start by cultivating your clients. And by that, I mean, we find that a lot of our clients who are developers or landowners kind of have a very fixed idea of what a place should look like and a place should be. And actually, we spend a lot of time kind of trying to educate them and showing them examples and best practice, etc., to try and get them to maybe think a bit outside the box in terms of what places can look like. This image on the screen now, I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's the Pierre Oudolph garden, probably sort of the most famous of the natural landscape designers operating at the moment, and it's at the Hauser and Worth Gallery in Bruton in Somerset. And we actually took one of our clients who's based down in the southwest here for the day, just to kind of show them around really, and show them a landscape that's very different to anything that they'd kind of seen before, to sort of explain to them a bit more about the approach that we wanted to take with the landscape on their scheme. This isn't necessarily all native planting, and I'll come on to that in a moment, but it is that sort of naturalistic style, the less formal manicured style, which we think is quite important. So the second point would then be minimised disturbance of the existing, and this is something which I think is relevant on greenfield sites or city centre brownfield sites. This is a picture from Bishopsgate Goods Yard in central London, right next to Liverpool Street, and we did a site visit there a number of years ago now. I was leading the design review actually for this scheme. We're sort of hearing a bit about design review earlier. We went and had a look around, and this has basically been derelict since the 1960s, completely derelict since the 80s when there was a large fire, and is now coming forward as a major mixed-use scheme right on the boundary between the city and the London boroughs of Tower Hamlets and Hackney. But actually what you realise when you go into the site and walk around it is, because it has been closed off, nature's kind of regenerated, and there's a lot already there which may look like scrub. It's buddleia and wild grown trees and grasses, but actually there's a lot there in terms of nature and environment, and it isn't as simple as wiping it away. And I think often on greenfield schemes, people will look at trying to retain hedgerows, and that will come up, and we've heard a lot about those sort of LVIAs and how you approach designing schemes using landscape character existing on greenfield. But I think actually it's really important to recognise that there is existing landscape on brownfield as well. And I know a scheme that I'll show an example of in a minute in another one in Hackney, where actually early phases of the master plan kind of did almost do a scorched earth policy. They demolished existing buildings, took out existing landscape, apart from 1 or 2 trees which were retained. And actually now they're coming forward with later phases. They're doing a lot more work to retain a lot more trees. And even, you know, before it was always, if it's not category A, then we'll just wipe it out. Whereas now they're looking at trying to keep as many as possible, because there's a lot more recognition of the value of that existing landscape, even if it isn't, you know, the finest specimen trees. And then the third one is, how closely will you emulate the native landscape? And I suppose by this, what I mean is that landscape isn't a single thing. It's, you know, woodland, it's river, it's steeply sloping land, it's flat land. And I think when we're looking at designing areas, and it comes back to what we've heard a lot about already in terms of landscape character, and really understanding that before you start, is, you know, what are we trying to recreate here? It's very easy to look at a greenfield site, do an LVIA, say, oh, well, you know, it's this landscape character, but when we put houses on it, it's going to change the landscape character. So is it about trying to retain as much of that as possible? Is it about looking at other landscape characters in the area? Is it about looking at the existing urban landscape? You know, very often these housing schemes will be on the edge of built up areas. So is it about looking at the character of the existing town and how we can relay that into the new housing, as much as kind of trying to hang on to those kind of last vestiges of the landscape character that were there before? Fourth one then is allocating landscape types. So by this, I mean, you know, the example I put up here is Stowe in Buckinghamshire, probably one of the best known and finest examples of the English landscape garden in the traditional style. And of course, you know, a completely man-made landscape, even though it's designed, you know, people look at it and think it's all very natural. But what it does do is it shows how you can juxtaposition water and trees and lawn and planting, and that kind of sort of man's hand in the natural landscape and shaping it. And it's something which, you know, has a very long history in this country from this era. You know, lots of famous names, whether it, you know, Repton, Capability Brown, etc., in terms of how we manage these landscapes and how we sort of allocate these spaces. And I think particularly on the largest scale of schemes, you need to think about where are the different areas going to go, how are they going to be used, how does it relate to those future uses, you know, where do play areas need to be most effective. If you want an area of woodland that's going to be kind of untouched, where can you put that where it's going to be less used by people? Fifth point is always use native plant communities as your base. I think a lot more now is being thought about in terms of native planting. By native, the key thing is that we do mean native and not just naturalistic. You know, that garden that we saw at the beginning, the Peter Odolph one, that's naturalistic planting, but actually a lot of those plants in there won't be native to the UK. And it's kind of looking a bit wild. It doesn't necessarily mean it's native at all. And I think we need to be very careful when we're looking at that and the provenance of planting and seed mixes. You know, there's a lot of issues at the moment with biosecurity and diseases. And obviously, historically, Dutch elm disease is, you know, the famous kind of biosecurity issue of the past, but now we've got ash dieback and other things which are, you know, just showing how this kind of importation of plant material can bring disease with it and cause problems, and even to the standard of having kind of local provenance. So we're now specifying native seed mixes for grassland, for example, which actually comes from within the area. So we're working on a scheme at the moment in Devon, and that will be seed that has been collected in Devon. It's not just a native to the UK that might have been collected in, I don't know, Suffolk, you know, and moved across the country. It's actually a native to the county. And the sixth point is factoring in natural processes of change. So by that, I mean, you know, what we kind of know as a landscape architect, and my background is as a landscape architect and then moving into urban design, that you know, we can't always plant the mature thing, and landscapes change over time. So we need to think about kind of that long-term vision. You know, I put up the image of Stowe before. You know, the designers at Stowe would never ever have seen the landscape as it is today, but that's kind of what they saw when they planted it. When they planted it, the trees were this big, you know, and now they've become mature parkland. And I think we have, to a certain extent, maybe lost that slightly, but we need to think a lot more about how landscapes will operate on the day they open, but then also how they're managed and how they sort of morph into longer term landscapes. Seventh one, occupy all the spaces. So kind of by that, I mean, think about everything from building front to building front. This is that other scheme I was talking about, Woodbury Down in Hackney, an estate regeneration project. This is all new housing. This was the one where it was kind of a bit scorched earth in these early phases. Perhaps that tree on the left might have been an original tree that was left over, but certainly everything else was just demolition of buildings, clearance of what landscape was there. But at the same time, what's gone back in Spring Park here, and what you can't see is the reservoirs. It sits on the side of reservoirs, which are just kind of in the distance of that image. But you know, they have gone from building front to building front. So there's no road here. There's a kind of shared path which has emergency vehicle access, but you can kind of see right from the fences of the private gardens on the ground floor. They've used planting in different ways. They've got some areas of lawn for play, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But they literally have looked at every sort of square inch of that space and thought about what can go in it and how that will grow. Make best use of water. So again, sustainable drainage is a key thing. This is an image from just across from where I'm here in Hackney Wick in East London in the Olympic Park. You know, and this is a swale feature that's been put in. It's been designed as part of a landscape. It becomes a feature. There are bridges across it. Children can run along and play in it. It's only wet when it's on the heaviest days of rain, but it is really thoroughly integrated into the landscape. And while SUDs are certainly becoming more and more important, and you know, there's some really good examples out there. Very often they are still a bit of an afterthought. You know, very often the kind of, well, pipe it into a crate underground just to deal with a runoff issue is the first port of call. And actually looking at how it can be incorporated and used as part of the landscape is really much more than just about kind of putting in a swale or a bioretention pond on the edge of a new development. 9 point is limit the lawns. So having just sort of shown that park example before, I think there is obviously a place for lawn, but it's about limiting its use really, because A, it's high maintenance, B, it's low value in terms of biodiversity. You know, we've got climate and biodiversity emergencies which we're trying to deal with. This is a scheme up in Nottinghamshire which kind of really extols a lot of those issues that I was just talking about. You know, acres of lawn which has to be maintained and mown with very little biodiversity value within it. Water management is by a swale pond on the left hand side there, fenced off, you know, not really designed as part of the landscape other than just being a feature. And this kind of sort of housing scheme where the landscape is an afterthought or it's just a bit of greenwash around the edges is something which we really need to move away from going forward. And then my final point is keep the exotics and invasives away. In the planting world, there's a fine line between, you know, a weed and one man's weed is another man's exotic plant. But we do need to look at how we use them, and while there is a place for them, it's trying to kind of minimize the use, and certainly kind of going back to that point before, which is using native plant communities as your base. I think there are, you know, some great examples. This is the Canary Wharf Roof Garden in London. Yeah, a fantastic amenity landscape space that's been created, a variety of native and non-native plants in here. But, you know, it works really well because of what it is. It's a set piece landscape to go and visit. And it's a great location to see some exotic plants because of that. But when we're looking at the kind of wider landscape, I think trying to move away from the use of exotic plants is something we should be aiming for. So what do we sort of mean in terms of how we can put all this together? Well, I think the couple of schemes that we're involved with, working with Clifton Emery Design, who we work on a number of projects with very closely. And I just want to talk about two of them in particular. And the first one is actually in Plymouth. This is Barn Barton. And it's a scheme where we've got Building with Nature Accreditation. I don't know how many people have heard of the Building with Nature programme, but it's a really good program where this is just I did a screenshot. Sorry, it's PDF really blurrily, but have a look at their website. Let me just see what it is. I can tell everyone it's buildingwithnature.org.uk is the website. But basically it's the toolkit. There's loads of case studies. There's training they offer. There are things you can download about how to design with nature. They have assessors accreditation that all come out and will assess a scheme, and you can put it forward for building with nature accreditation. And really it is kind of looking at how you can focus developments onto really thinking about the importance of nature and green infrastructure from day one. I was pleasantly surprised to see this morning when I went to do this screenshot that this image, the developer's image, is actually our scheme in Barnbarton, and they've also got the project on there. Go back to it as as one of their case studies. So it tells you a bit more there about the approach that we took and how we look to incorporate green infrastructure as a key part of it. And this is the scheme. It's a kind of well, they called it the forgotten corner of Plymouth, but it's social housing now managed by Clarion, and we were kind of asked to prepare a master plan for the area to make improvements to it, which we did, trying to retain, retaining as many of the existing trees and as much of the existing landscape as possible, because although the buildings are in really bad condition and need to be replaced, there's a lot of mature landscape, and you can see here, it's not well incorporated. It's hard for pedestrians to get around. There are steep slopes, but at the same time there's some really strong mature landscape framework to work within, and that was something that certainly came out in the public consultation events we undertook, where people were really keen to retain that kind of green setting. They felt it was a very verdant setting that they had and wanted to retain as much of that as possible in the new scheme. So what we looked to do was to plot a number of those existing trees, retain some of the key ones where we can, and then obviously in some cases we were looking to possibly translocate trees as well, and then sort of replace the buildings with new development and new building forms, but to sort of maintain these green streets, and to really create a character that kind of built on what they had there already, but through new planting, bringing in more grass, more landscape areas, sort of incidental areas for people to play. This concept we had here of the green street, with these terraced sort of spaces and landscapes, dealing with those complex change of levels, but by using a much more naturalistic sort of style of planting than the amenity grassland which they have existing. And then finally, another scheme which is at a kind of earlier stage, just going into planning. This is, or it's now working with Backhouse Housing in, forgotten, mine's gone blank where it is, but we were asked to do the Midsummer Norton. We prepared the master plan originally for the landowner, which was for a new school, care home facility, and housing. You can sort of see the housing there in the middle at the back of the scheme. And then we were retained by Backhouse when they bought and took over that housing element. And we're just currently kind of working up proposals now, where we're looking at how we can again incorporate a number of these features. Here there's a lot less landscape to try and incorporate, but where it does exist, we're looking to keep it, to use hedgerows, retain hedgerows within the landscape, put in again more natural planting, and look at how we can use mowing as a way of creating areas for people to play, to walk the dog kind of within the more natural landscape, and having this balance between sort of private front gardens and then the public shared spaces at the heart of the scheme. And again, here another example, just using the idea of a mown path through to create a route and a walking space that people can use for walking the dogs or for kids to play, and really kind of how you can sort of build these new features around an existing. So this is an existing tree on the left there, which we're retaining, and kind of creating this green space around it to make the most of it. I think that's the end of my slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And we have a question in the chat for you from Rebecca from Bucks. asking, was there a significant increase in density in Plymouth?
There's not a significant increase. There is an increase. I can't off the top of my head think what the numbers were. But yes, there is definitely an increase. I'll tell you what, I will look up the numbers while we're talking. If anyone has any other questions, I can look that up while we're talking.
Sorry about that. I'm getting lots of problems with my Zoom unmuting. So has anyone got any further questions? Yes, we've got one from Felicity. Do we have a good example of an integrated soil in a development? Is that correct? Soil?
I think it's typo, should be swale, yeah.
Swale.
Okay, who wants to take that? Ian, do you want to answer that one?
While Ian comes back in, there's a scheme I worked on years ago,
okay,
in Upton in Northamptonshire, which did some fantastic work on suds and swales. That's well worth checking out.
I was going to say, Tom, that's the go-to prime example, isn't it, of effective swales in an urban development.
Are there any others that we could look at as well as the go-to?
I mean, the trouble with a lot of water management in new developments is actually exactly that picture that Paul showed of the scheme in Edwalton and Nottinghamshire, where it's, you know, a ditch that's fenced off. I mean, it's just so disappointing. And there is, you know, and showing the Olympic Park, which was obviously a big scheme that LDA worked on for many years, and we're still working on a number of schemes around the Olympic Park, but the water management in the Olympic Park is absolutely fantastic. Nothing is fenced off. It's part of the environment and part of the landscape that you enjoy.
Yeah,
I can add to the swale, if I may. Yeah, if you're willing to come up to Manchester, the excellent RHS Bridgewater, which opened in the summer or late spring. Some really excellent swales to be seen there, forming part of the car parking area and all the sort of access routes. So some really good example there if you're willing to come up north.
Where good examples are found, it's generally because the water engineers work very collaboratively with the ecologist and the landscape architect and sort of explored what's possible, because a straight engineering response can be sort of single function, whereas when there's proper engagement through the design process, you can get play even or biodiversity enhancement and something much better than a fenced off area of disappointing grass, as we can see in quite a lot of developments.
Okay, Andrew, you had your hand up.
Hi, yeah, it was a follow-on question from that, really, as to what your views were on safety in the design of those kind of features, and how you deal with those issues. Some of the best play spaces I've seen have been kids, and there's one in Upton actually, in one of the later phases, where the kids, some of them play in the play area, but quite a lot of them play in the swales at the edges of the play area. And seem to be great places to play, but quite often there's a requirement to put up fences or to deal with risk somehow. Just wondered what your take is on that.
Who wants to take that one?
I can come in on it if you want. I mean, I think it's like everything really. It's about balancing, you know, the likelihood of harm and the seriousness of the harm. I mean, what we find is in some schemes that obviously part of it's about modelling and knowing how often these features are going to be wet. You know, a lot of them are dry 99% of the time, and actually, you know, it's very unlikely anyone will be out there on the rare occasions when they're wet, because it's going to be raining so bloody hard. No one would want to be out in their right mind anyway. So actually, on those, there isn't a requirement to do it. On other hands, ponds that are often designed to be wet the majority of the time, and some are, then they do tend to need fencing and more careful management. But again, what we're finding more and more is that schemes where you actually have it integrated throughout the development kind of has less risk, because they tend to be shallower, they're more gentle. You know, that example, that photograph from Nottinghamshire, you know, is the kind of worst of both worlds. It's a steep grassy bank that you can quite easily slip and fall down into a pond at the bottom that's wet, and you'd probably drown. So I think, again, you know, it's the thought that goes into the design, and I think we'll see more and more good examples coming through. I mean, what I would say is one of the places we always look for things is the Housing Design Awards. There are some really good, really strong schemes on there, and it's always a good website to go and have a look at if you're looking for case studies. They have built and unbuilt section, but if you sort of go through the built schemes that have won Housing Design Awards, then very often you'll find good examples of all manner of things. You know, whether it's a good example of a mews street or a shared surface or a cut through or a swale or whatever. We often use that as a way of finding things to show people. So just to say the housing numbers, so it went from 204 to 226. So there's a slight increase in density, but not a massive one.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, we worked on the Langarth Garden Village down in Truro, and Suds was very, very much part of the master plan, and we actually incorporated quite a lot of sorry, I'm going on to attenuation basins now, actually, but linked into the swales. But they form very much part of the play and depressions in the land. But I think, as the previous speakers said, really it was about making sure that the slopes were suitable and suitable for play. But yeah, a good example of how to integrate it with play.
I think there's a lot of different kinds as well now, isn't there? I think if you look at the centre of Sheffield, the Suds there is effectively just rain gardens. You know, it just looks like areas of planting, but the way they've been designed in detail, that the curbs allow water into the areas of planting, is effectively operating as Suds, but looks very different to what you might imagine as well, looking just like an area of gravel and planting. And there's also some very simple, I think, examples. Countryside properties in housing schemes, I think, have a number of very low-key Suds designs that they integrate to the sun, in the southern extension to Cambridge, where it's just I think unfortunately it's mown grass, but it is just a shallow hollow next to the road, and because it's not very deep, and because the gradients aren't very steep, it's just kept very simple, which I think is often the key to this. It doesn't become a huge part of the street cross section. It's only a metre or so across. But it just gathers the water of the highways and is all part of the kind of Suds hierarchy. So I think there's examples where they're done in a very low-key way as well, which perhaps is slightly different to the Upton one, where it's made into a real feature.
Yeah, just building on that, Dave, and responding to Avril, who had a question in the chat. Often problems stem from land budgets. Highly engineered takes less land. Better integrated takes more land. The land assembly part of the process is really, really important, and we're going to see greater demands on the land, and integrative design thinking, by example, to deliver biodiversity net gain means we're going to have to look more creatively at how land is managed, and that issue of single function is not going to be able to be credible anymore in the way that we design, picking up all Tom's points about climate change, biodiversity and placemaking, which is, I think, another consideration. So it starts at the beginning of a project to see how land's assembled, to make sure you've got the room to do what you need to do.
I think just coming in on that as well, we did a piece of work a year or so ago with the British Geological Survey, actually looking at how developers, and I say developers, it's probably more kind of early stage development work, but actually how they use the data sets that are held by the BGS to look at drainage at the earliest stage, because one of the things that we found through the research with that was how very often schemes that are kind of on the verge of viability can be undone by not thinking about things like this early enough, and suddenly they find that they need a slightly bigger retention pond because they hadn't, you know, looked at the infiltration rates early enough. And then when you lose 2 or 3 houses because you've got to do a bit more to keep the water, to get the water management sorted, suddenly a scheme that was viable becomes not viable. So actually kind of thinking about these things right at the beginning is really, really important to make sure that the schemes kind of stay viable and are delivered the way you want them to be throughout the whole process.
Yeah, and building on that, in response to Malcolm, who said many projects begin with good intentions to provide extensive mature planting, but restriction of streetlight services, etc. The business as usual model isn't going to work. So why not consider putting the trees in continuously connective corridors so their roots and microsomal activity can connect, and then putting the services around them rather than starting with the services and squeezing in the trees in the space that's left. I think putting landscape considerations high up the agenda and earlier on in the discussion can only deliver better outcomes all round.
Okay, Catherine, do you want to come in with your question?
I was just really interested to hear about how we should be moving away from lawns, because often when you've got a scheme and you're looking at sort of providing 10% as open space, say, lawn is often what we think of. And I just wondered what other things we should be thinking of. Can you include woodland, for example, in that sort of calculation? Yeah, just interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Tim, can you come in on that?
I can say something if you like. I don't know if Ian's there.
Okay.
We just worked on it's a very interesting point. We just worked on a project in Plymouth as well, actually at Coipel, which the site inherited a huge area of woodland as part of it. 40% of the site was woodland. And so we started the conversation there with the local authority about what the open space was going to look like, because in terms of the overall character of what we were introducing as a housing-led scheme, we didn't want to actually introduce areas of traditional open space. We wanted to enhance the woodland resource that was there, extend it in places actually, and we sort of agreed that all the open space requirement would be in the woodland or on the edge of the woodland. So we did integrate some more traditional play into that, but actually a large element of it was more naturalistic play within the woodland. And then working with what was there again in terms of other open space types like allotments and community growing spaces, that was integrated in a slightly different way in terms of orchards and those kind of things that fit with the characteristics of the existing site. So yeah, certainly at Coipel we were able to agree that the open space wasn't just the traditional fenced off lap, leap or an area of mow grass.
We're in another part of LDA, I'm working on a garden village as well at the minute, and we're aiming for 50% public open space, and very little of it is likely to end up as mown grass. It's a mosaic of different landscapes that go throughout the development, and multifunctional landscapes. And I think that's the key thing for us. Every bit of space needs to work much harder now, whether you're putting a house on it, a school on it, or a playground. We're trying to find as much use out of that space as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the same. You probably didn't notice it, but the image in the background of my kind of title slide was another scheme we're working on down in Devon, and that's got probably 2/3 of the open spaces kind of grass. But again, it's like those images I did show. It's sort of mown areas, but also some naturalistic areas. And then the balance of the open space is a mixture of an orchard area, which was something that's very characteristic of that landscape historically. So we're putting a new orchard in for the residents to use, which again will be a kind of local shade tolerant grass mix underneath the trees, the apple trees and the fruit trees. And then part of it's also going to be a wooded glade, which is existing on the site, and we're expanding it, and we need to put some screening planting in, so we're going to be kind of incorporating that into that area, and that, but it is being counted towards the open space for the scheme.
I'd like to add to that and just make a shout out for food being integrated into residential developments in particular, and space for growing food for communities. I think will be a really great addition to a lot more projects and developments, and not just squeezed to the sides, but integrated throughout, and orchards, edible streets. You know, there's loads of ways that food can be integrated creatively.
Okay, can we have Nikki's question now, please? You there, Nikki?
Hello, sorry. Yes, I'm here. I think it's clear. It's really local government landscape officer deals with LVIAs all the time, and they're on the whole very disappointing. And I always hear landscape practices talking about the processes that should be followed, and Lvia and all of the guidance that's available. But we just find regularly, it's just such common occurrence that landscape character is either misunderstood or it's just overlooked, and what the landscapes that we have already, or the elements that go towards making them special as they are often misunderstood or sort of almost misleadingly overlooked. And we may be creating new good landscapes, but I think this understanding of what things are at presently, currently, is just a big problem with LVIAs. And we are very typical. I mean, almost 80-90% just look at the AONB characteristics or the landscape character assessment district, local district landscape character assessment, and just go, oh, well, this is just one field in a big area, so it's not going to affect it. So that's it, landscape character sorted. And it just happens time and again. And I just wondered why. It's just quite interesting to have a chance to ask some landscape practices why that happens so regularly in their assessment.
Yeah. Go on, Tim, you go first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for your question, Nikki, and I'm sorry that you're finding that. I think, yeah, as you suggest, landscape character is probably just a bit harder sometimes to assess compared with views. Its views tend to be a little bit more obvious. I think it's good practice to, when we're doing LVIAs, to assess the effect on the site. Clearly, what you've encountered is that people are assessing the site within the context of a very much bigger area. But I would hope that certainly where I work is that we would assess the effect of character on the site itself, and then the wider study area, and then the landscape character area itself. So it seems unfortunate that some of the developers are coming forward with probably LVIs are not fully following best practice, which I'm sorry to hear. I don't know if anyone at LDA wants to add to that.
I will add to that. I'd agree that with you that it's important to assess effects on site fabric, and that needs to be a clear narrative. The way that character is dealt with is mixed, because I've reviewed lots of LVIAs, but it is absolutely essential that it's given due weight and consideration, because it's character that really matters. As for the issue of protected landscapes, I think that is an area of particularly poor practice in lots of areas, because what that part of the assessment should do, separate to the assessment of effects on visual receptors and landscape character, is assess the effects of the development on the natural beauty and special qualities, i.e. the reason for the designation. And we've done an exercise in Suffolk Coast and Heaths where we worked with the AONB partnership to define what the natural beauty special qualities were, and then use those as an agreed basis for assessing the effects of a proposal on them. That I don't think's been done before, and part of the issue is many AONB management plans don't contain the level of baseline evidence needed to define and describe what the natural beauty and special qualities are. And there's good guidance out there from Natural England on what they should include. I'd point to that early dialogue with the local planning officer and the AONB officer if you've got a development in a protected landscape or in its setting, just to understand and agree the baseline conditions against which the assessment should be done. And I think there should there could be a bit more guidance that could be provided by the Institute on this matter.
Okay, that's great. Is that okay for you, Nikki?
Thank you. Yeah.
And Avril, you've got a couple of questions. Have they been covered now, or have you got still some more questions you need to put forward?
Sorry, no, I'm fine. I was just putting a local example of where there's some quite good integrated sets to visit. The Swindon at the Tadpole Garden
Okay,
village.
lovely. Great. And you're happy with your other question earlier on?
Oh, I can go on forever, so I won't ask any.
No, you can ask away. That's the whole point of today.
No, it's fine. Yeah, they covered mine. I'm a local government landscape architect or landscape officer, so I'm quite familiar with most of the issues, and that most of the people probably have dealt with me.
Right.
Maura, what was the outcomes of the poll? Do you know? The various
you can just click on the poll and let me share the results. Sorry. As you'll see, we've got people who don't feel there's enough understanding across planning industry for landscape. The landscape officers, 27% in teams, so quite a small amount, only a quarter across our delegates, and pretty much 50-50 on people using design codes. So I don't know if anyone's surprised really by those statistics and people's feelings on landscape from today's audience. But I think that's, why we needed to put a Bob MK landscape event together.
Maura, I'm on the policy committee for the Landscape Institute. So could you email me those results and I'll feed them back? Because I think as a straw poll of, 50 odd local authority officers, I think that's really useful insight. I'd be more than happy to share and hopefully put it to good use.
Yeah, no problem. And all the examples that you've talked about, I don't know, for example, Tom, if your garden village were able to share it, but if I could get some of those examples and I could send them around to the delegates so then they can see some of the good practice in place that we're talking about as opposed to some of the bad. So we'll just overrun a little bit there, but I'd like to thank all our experts today. It's been very enlightening for me, especially. I hope it's been useful. If you've got any further questions, do feel free to email Bob MK or to email me directly, and I can put them to the panel, because they're obviously all very passionate about landscape and all very keen to help and give you their responses. As I said, I'm getting one new message, and that's just saying it's been really useful. So that's really great. So it's great that the delegates are finding it useful and that the speakers are really enjoying engaging with Bob MK. And, thank you very much for coming to Bob MK today. It's been really great for us. And hopefully we'll be able to follow up and do another landscape thing, probably within 12 months, as well as, look at Broadmeadow and any other good examples. On a wider note, Bob MK are hoping to go out on our first visit. And so I'll let delegates know when we're going to meet up, and we're going to go and look around. We hope to look around Barton Park and its development and how it's moved forward since we went there in 2018. And also our next event will be looking at lots of different professions and areas of things and lots of case studies, hopefully a little bit like today, but across a lot of different disciplines. Anyway, thank you all very much, speakers and delegates, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.